significant expansion of climate finance for developing countries like those in the Caribbean is needed to enable the shift towards low-emission, climate-resilient development pathways and to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. While quantifying the levels of climate finance mobilized is important for transparency in assessing progress towards commitments made, quantity alone is not sufficient. It is the means to an end, and not the end in itself. Ensuring the underlying quality or effectiveness of climate finance will also be crucial. Hence, issues of how different communities view climate finance effectiveness, the policies or institutional preconditions that facilitate effectiveness, and how effectiveness can be monitored and evaluated are all important. Ensuring that climate finance is used effectively will help to maximize its impact. This discussion this morning therefore aims to 1. Explore how climate finance effectiveness is viewed, 2. Enhance understanding of the factors that can impact the effectiveness of climate finance, and 3. Discuss and raise awareness of new strategies, tools, and approaches for both increasing climate finance flows and improving their effectiveness over the coming years, including through new initiatives like the CDB Climate Finance Climate Change Project Preparation Facility. Good morning, I am O'Reilly Lewis. I'm the Director of Projects at the Caribbean Development Bank. This morning we have 5 esteemed panelists. I would invite them each to introduce themselves, but they are Valerie Isaac, the Division Chief of Environmental Sustainability from the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Colin Young, Executive Director of the 5 Cs, Mr. Rodinal Suma, Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Development Fund, Mr. Paul Hilaire, Permanent Secretary from the Government of St. Lucia, and Mr. Marco Davila from the European Investment Bank. And we welcome them to the panel. I'm going to start with Valerie, and you can introduce yourself before you give the answer, if that's okay. As a development entity supporting regional climate change actions, what do you see as new strategies or approaches needed to scale up the quantity and enhance the quality of climate finance for the Caribbean countries?
Thank you, O'Reilly. And just to repeat, I'm Valerie Isaac. I'm the Division Chief for Environmental Sustainability at the bank. And the unit is responsible for managing the climate, disaster risk management, and environmental management across the operations of the bank. One of the things we know is that the quality and quantity of climate finance is really important for its effectiveness. And in the case of the Caribbean, we think scaling up this finance requires a multifaceted approach or multifaceted approaches. And these approaches need to address both the immediate financial needs as well as the longer term sustainability of the sort of climate action required in the region. From the quantity perspective, we do need strategies that really enhance the coordination and collaboration and should I say the simplification of the climate finance architecture. And that would help enable our clients to access the climate finance that they so desperately need. But all of it is not about just the quantity of finance. One of the things we know, the quality matters in the sense that we want finance that is also highly concessional, as well as adequate, so that it doesn't really worsen the financial circumstances the fiscal, I should say, the fiscal circumstances of of our clients. Um, we One of the things we need to ensure is that to maximize the impact of climate finance, we need to consider that we need to consider the importance of designing the priority programs and projects that are sort of socially inclusive and gender responsive. Um, Strategies that permit the engagement of the private sector as far as possible become really important. And some of the things, just as a way of example, I just mentioned the issue of green bonds, blue bonds. We've had examples of Jamaica, we have examples of Belize, Barbados, and that's one opportunity where we can increase the quantity of financing by developing the green bond market to attract the sort of private capital that the region could need. With the bank, we continue to explore the sort of strategic partnerships that with private sector all around scaling up the finance, as well as exploring various climate finance instruments, including instruments like what the climate resilient debt clauses, which Barbados and some of the other countries currently have in place. So at this point, these are some of the approaches that I think the bank, not I think, these are some of the approaches that the bank is exploring. Thanks, sir.
All right, thank you, Ms. Isaac. I'm now go to Mr. Rodinal Zuma. Could you build on the comments from CDB from the CDF's perspective as to how can we scale up the quantities and enhance the quality of climate finance? And you could briefly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, O'Reilly. Well, first of all, my name is Rodinal Suma. I'm the CEO of the CARICOM Development Fund, CDF. CDF is a CARICOM institution established by treaty specifically to attend to the development challenges and opportunities in the disadvantaged countries, regions, and sectors in CARICOM, so as to enable them to optimize the benefits of their participation in the thrust to deeper integration through the CARICOM single market and economy. And our mandate therefore spans both integration and development. So we have become increasingly active in the climate finance space as one of the thematic areas in which member states expect us to execute our mandate. Yeah, so building on some of the points that Valerie made, I want to sort of divide these points into the quality, looking at the quality side and then the quantity side. So in terms of the quality, enhancing the quality of climate finance, I think there are a couple of areas we need to focus on. I know it's something that we speak about all the time, but it remains relevant, and it's building capacity across the entire system in member states, regional institutions, across coordination mechanisms, to ensure that we have the sort of collaboration that we need to address the priority climate actions in the member countries. Ultimately, and this is a point we probably going to come to a little later, I think capacity building efforts need to be focused at the national level as the ideal, and then all other partners should seek to augment capacity at the national level. Because I think that's the only way you could generate the scale. First of all, you need to have the ownership, and the only way you could generate the scale that's required is if you have the capacity at the national level to coordinate and crowd in climate finance, working with partners rather than the other way around. So that's one. In terms of, on the quality side also, stakeholder consultation is critical because you can't know if you're effective if you're not addressing local needs as understood by persons who are affected by the impacts of climate change. So that is absolutely critical. So we have to improve our processes of stakeholder consultation, the depth and the comprehensiveness of it. I mean, Valerie did mention certain aspects of it in terms of social inclusiveness and gender responsiveness. But getting down to local communities and understanding how they interpret the impacts of climate change and what solutions that they can come up with themselves will be important to ensuring effectiveness. On the quantity side, we really need to scale up. And you know, it's really unfortunate that we have to be thinking of repeating the fact that the Caribbean is one of the areas that's in the SIDS that are most affected by the impacts of climate change, but our track record in accessing climate finance is probably the worst. We are way behind. So scaling up is an urgent imperative for us, and there are a number of ways that we can seek to do this. We need to strengthen our relationship with the climate funds that have been established, including the Loss and Damage Fund, which is now emerging, ensuring that those of us that are already in the space are recognized by the Loss and Damage Fund as actors and viable partners that can bring the climate finance to the region to implement the much needed projects. And we also need to strengthen our partnerships with donors that are active in the space. There's no way we can do this alone. I mean, you can only scale up if you are collaborating with donors that have the resources, that have an interest and a mandate to work in the Caribbean. But we have, just as I'm advocating for countries to be in a position to lead on the mobilization effort and in the coordination effort, regional institutions have a critical facilitative and brokering role to play in crowding in financing from donors that have an interest in working in the region in this field. And finally, for the time being, we need to engage a lot more in developing innovative financing mechanisms that address our climate priorities. Valerie mentioned a couple of them, blue and green bonds. I'll just mention quickly at this point that one of the things that the CDF has done is in January this year, we launched the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, which focuses on building both climate and economic resilience. And that facility, as Valerie mentioned, one of the areas we need to target is to bring in more private sector financing. That facility is looking at how we can get more private sector financing into resilience building in the region, both climate resilience building and economic resilience building. So I think we need to do much more of that sort of innovative financing ourselves and not have to rely entirely on the mobilization of climate finance from the existing climate finance institutions, because we know that the process of mobilizing that money is woefully slow and very painful. So these are some of the areas I think we can focus on in enhancing both quality and quantity of climate finance.
All right, thank you, Radinal. Another follow-up question, Radinal. This is in respect of the outcomes, the factors that could impact the outcomes negatively or positively from your experience in the Caribbean in terms of the impact of climate finance on the ground.
Right. Okay, so that is a good question, and I was reflecting on how best to answer this question. We can't really speak meaningfully about how we could improve outcomes if our track record in accessing climate finance is so poor, right? So we maybe have to take a few steps back and look at the terms and the conditions under which climate finance are being made available and the ease of access. I think these questions we need to address first, and then we can start talking about outcomes. Maybe 5Cs can speak a little bit about outcomes because you have a more of a track record than the rest of us, right? So I will kind of, pivot more towards issues of terms and conditions and effectiveness with which we could access those funds, if I can quickly. So one of the major factors on the negative side that we have to guard against is ensuring that we don't exacerbate the debt situation in the countries. So some of the climate finance is available as debt financing. So we need to ensure that we can mobilize greater quantities of grants and highly concessional debt if we have to mobilize debt financing. And secondly, there's a huge climate finance gap in the region. So we need to be able to act, aggressively and simultaneously across institutions, partners, and member states. So I think what we need to do is in our scaling up is to go regional. One of the things we need to do is go regional. We need to do two things simultaneously. We need to scale up vertically by ensuring that we can mobilize financing that allows us to implement projects at scale in each member state. And we also need to scale up horizontally by going regional. And when you scale up vertically, you benefit obviously from technical economies of scale, because it takes the same amount of time and effort to develop a $5 million or $10 million project as it does to do a $50 million project. So you will obviously benefit from economies of scale if you can mobilize these resources at scale to implement at the levels that are required. And then if you scale horizontally, then you benefit from administrative economies of scale, because all of the project design and implementation structures you put in place can then be deployed to serve a number of countries at the same time. So I think that's two of the things that we could do. And we need to work on absorptive capacity, which relates back now to the capacity of the countries to both design and implement projects. So to build on the point that I made earlier, we know that the countries are struggling. On top of all of the administrative arrangements that they put in place to drive the development agenda, they now have to put new systems and structures in place to deal with the climate crisis, right? But you have to do it in such a way that you don't duplicate. So there must be a way that governments could synergize their efforts in terms of driving the development agenda while dealing with the climate crisis at the same time. And I suspect Paul will want to speak a little bit about that on the national level. What I have found from my own experience is that you have a proliferation of structures being put in place in governments to focus on specific things like project units, implementation units, when what you really need is to restructure the government system and redeploy capacity to deal with the priorities, right? And that's what you need to do. And then if you do that, then it becomes easier for regional institutions with specific sectoral mandates to partner with you, because you would have the capacity and then there are points of articulation and synergy that we can create with the member states. I'm sure there are many other things that I could say. Maybe they'll come out in the discussion, but these are some of the things that are top of mind for me. Ensuring that we don't exacerbate the debt situation, ensuring that we build capacity around the priorities in a system-wide way, starting with governments, and employing strategies that allow us to scale vertically and horizontally.
Those are excellent answers. Although you said you weren't answering the question, you actually did. You pointed to a lot of the challenges that we face, and I would like to ask P.S. Hilaire his thoughts on some of the comments he made, specifically in relation to the reform that he's suggesting that's needed in the government sector, in governments to help to address the implementation challenges, the absorptive capacity challenges that he identified. Any thoughts on that from St. Lucia's point of view?
Thank you, Chairman, or Masters of Proceedings. It's always a challenge to respond to Rodinal Suma, but I will attempt to do the best that I can. He indicated a fundamental issue. I mean, we are all aware we have what you call an implementation deficit in the Caribbean. There is no dispute in that area. And in so doing, he indicated the need for capacity building. It is an area that we have discussed over a very long period of time as to how we will resolve the inefficiencies given at the national level to deal with those issues that we have. So when you really look at it, you look at in terms of the gap which exists in terms of financial resources and also the technical competence. So speaking towards the technical competence at the time being, and Mr. Suma is so correct in when he said that you have a number of various projects and institutions coming into the region to provide funding for implementation of projects. And what I have observed recently is that almost all of them are asking for the establishment of specific units. And look at small countries like ours, and for every project, you're doing a flood mitigation project, you're doing a river stabilization project, you're doing a school project, and you have to set up a whole institution to do it, from project coordinators to FM to procurement, and you name it. And that in itself is posing a serious challenge in terms of getting the units prepared. In fact, in the first place, you may find that you're resource constrained. You may not be able to get what you're looking for. And that itself will also impact negatively on your ability to implement that program. So this is one of the other things. He also spoke of the absorptive capacity. And that's where it comes directly in linking whether when we are designing those projects and the demand of the donors in the resources that we are mobilizing, whether we have the absorptive capacity to deal with it. And he raised a very interesting point, which is something I've always said from my re-emergence in the economic development area, is that there is a need to strengthen your project units at the national level. I certainly don't support the notion that in recent times the economic development units at the various country level is simply preparing what you call concept notes and sending it to the various development institutions to develop full projects for you. I mean, that cannot work. You know the situation you're dealing with. You know the problem. You're the one that have to try to resolve it. So who is better at doing it than yourself? And in so doing, we now have to go back to when we were able to centralize those expertise. And in so doing, you will develop the cadre of persons that you need that could take the project from feasibility, when you have your identification of whatever issues that you're trying to resolve and how you would proceed in resolving it. There is also another point. I think he raised it indirectly, but I would probably want to elaborate on it a little further. And that is the prolonged period that it is taking for you to the funding agencies to make the monies available, whether it be climate finance, whether it be any other donor countries mobilizing the resources. There seems to be an inordinate long period of time. And look now, it is so prevalent under the whole climate discussion. In fact, you have the readiness. The readiness component of preparing a project takes 5-6 years. By the time that project is fully developed and ready for implementation, the situation on the ground has changed. And these are things that we have to look as to how quickly we could cause the action to take place. So all of that takes you back to, at the national level, your capacity you have developed. He also indicated about the debt issue, and I mean, this is quite relevant as well, because you would want to focus on, in as much as possible, in raising your financing, whether you are able to do it at more grant funding or very low interest rates, so to speak. Because right now, I mean, it's only yesterday I was at the UN Global area, then we were discussing the Blue Bond, of which Seneca is also a participant in the Blue Bond initiative. And we were speaking to some institutional investors in there who, want to participate in that take. But one of the things we observe is that the rate at which they want to make those monies available certainly cannot cut it for development growth. So you have to be very cognizant of the rate you're going to look into and how it impacts on your debt to GDP ratio. I mean, as in the case of Rodi, I have some more I could see, but as we go along, I will add my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. I almost wish I was on the panel. You raise a lot of interesting points there. On the issue of implementation, I will provide a comment on that, because what we have observed is that because the setting up of the project implementation units can be done with project funding, and you can import the capacity that you need if it's not in country, and inevitably it's not in the country, so you have project coordinators and specialists that you can pay for on the project. What we've observed is that has had limited impact in terms of the speeding up of the projects, because what we've seen is that implementation efficiency seems to be a function of the country rather than the project, which suggests to us that there are systemic things in in the public service system and how decisions are made that impact implementation more than the technical skills available to implement the project. One of the issues, for example, procurement, how procurement is handled in the country. There's still many of the countries where those final decisions are made at cabinet level. I'm going to get controversial. So we have scenarios where the technical teams would have done their work, but the outcome may be challenged at different levels. For example, this is just an example. So the issues of implementation and absorptive capacity are really complex, PS. I think that could be another discussion altogether, another session altogether. But I just wanted to say that we have to look at it from a higher level, a country level, and I'm agreeing with how Rodinald put it in terms of the government reform that's needed, I think, for us to really get anywhere in this respect. The whole of government approach to implementation efficiency. So Colin, you've gotten a lot of ideas put forward. I'm interested in your commentary, first of all, on some of the things specifically that PS Hilaire spoke about. And I would ask you to use the opportunity to say a few words about your organization.
Thank you, O'Reilly. I am Colin Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, known throughout the region as the 5 Cs. The 5 Cs, like the CDF, is an institution of the CARICOM community, or the Caribbean community, set up in 2005 to coordinate the region's response to climate change. And we do that doing 3 baskets of services. The first one is by mandate. We are to help ensure that the climate data and information is available. It's being collected, it's available, that can be used to make evidence-based decision making. And we've done a lot of building that capacity over the years by installing automatic weather stations, coral reef early warning systems. We now have LiDAR capability to do both bathymetric and topographic work. And all of that feeds into helping to make the climate rationale for projects. The second is that we are a delivery partner for CARICOM member states. We are accredited to the GCF Adaptation Fund. We manage projects for bilateral relationships. Our portfolio is about $170 million right now. We work in 16 countries, including Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And we have a portfolio of $500 million that we hope to deliver in the next couple of years. And the third area is we provide support to countries in ensuring that CARICOM has the priorities for the COP negotiation. So that's the elevator pitch in terms of what we do. This has, I think, a very interesting conversation, and I think there are elements of what has been said by all the speakers that are absolutely salient and important. And so I will try to focus on things that were not already mentioned because I align myself with almost all of them. So the first one, and because we're at the COP, I think we can't forget that if we start on the premise that the existing rules of the financial architecture for climate change are not working for us, then we have to change the rules. And to change the rules, we have to utilize the COP process to ask our member states, as they often do, that every time a minister or a head of government speak, that they ought to ensure that there is a demands made for the simplification of the access architecture and the reducing of the fragmenting of the donor relationships that we have. There is an agenda item at every COP that is guidance from the COP to the multilateral funds under the convention, which is the GEF, which is the Adaptation Fund, which is the Green Climate Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund. And the COP gives guidance to the boards of these funds, and then the boards of these funds then is supposed to implement the guidance, and one of that can be the access. So every time we gather, we complain about the architecture, but I don't think we spend enough time focusing on the pressure to change the rules, because the rules that were set initially are not working. And we see that, and Roddy talked about the fact that the Caribbean is the least funded geographic region under the GCF, for example, where out of the 12 or 13 billion that they have dispersed to date, the Caribbean has only seen about 550 million of those resources. So we're behind Asia Pacific, we're behind LDCs, we're behind Africa. So that's the first thing. And then we have to be walking and chewing gum at the same time. So while we're agitating for changing of the rules that will be more fit for purpose for small island developing states, and we have these same rules that, if we're not careful, will come into the loss and damage fund, will be in the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal, and then we'll be complaining about the same issues of not being able to access them. So it's important that the structure and the criteria and the rules for wrong disbursements, that these are informed by our existing realities and experiences in accessing the funds today. But the other, in terms of the capacity issues that we have, I think what is clear is that our countries need to pursue a more programmatic approach. And I know this is an overused word or phrase, programmatic approaches, because we have, I think, succeeded to some extent in projectizing our climate resilience work, project by project by project. And what is happening when we projectize it is that it is the same resources, human resources in the countries, that we're expecting to be able to respond to each of these projects with their own cycles of implementation, with their own project units, and that puts a pressure that is unrealistic on the public officers and so on in the ministries. So if for example, a country has a water climate resilience program, a national adaptation plan, rather than trying to implement 5 or 6 projects separately, we need to look at this as a program, even if you have different donor partners. And then you can set up, rather than having 5 project units, you treat this as a portfolio approach, where you have a team that is staff that can then implement the project. And O'Reilly, you made the point that has been not as effective, because one of the issues is that when projects end, the units disappear. And then you have to now re-procure these services again, and you're starting from scratch. And the good people that you've had are now taken up by somebody else. And so there's always this sort of the mouse on the wheel. And so I think what's key there is ensuring, and when I used to be a PS in the government of Belize many years ago, one of the things that we were relatively successful about is to get the government, after the project ends, 5 years or so, to then take that person or persons onto the public service, to ensure that the capacity is retained within the state. So that's one way. The other thing about the programmatic approach is that it allows us to look at how we can crowd in different types of finance. So if you know what your demands are for water or your energy or agriculture, whatever the thematic area is, then what that allows you to do is to look at the partners who you can work with, whether that's a CDB, whether that is a CDF, whether it's the 5Cs, whether that is international accredited entities or recurrent revenues from the government. But it's a very systematic approach it's essentially a financing strategy that you're putting together that is being treated as a program, and then now the countries approach those who have a competitive or comparative advantage in accessing those resources. That allows you to scale. It allows you to find complementarities and coherence in the donor landscape, and it allows you to think about the sustainability, because we haven't touched that at all at the end, because a fundamental part of an effective program is that it continues after the project funds ends. And oftentimes we are very challenged by the effectiveness. And then the last point I want to make on my reactions is that the implementation gap that the PS spoke about, it is absolutely real. And I often like to say, look, the Caribbean has smart people like everywhere else in the world. We have absolutely competent, smart, intelligent, capable professionals. The issue is we don't have enough of them in particular areas. And so they're overwhelmed by all the projects that are happening. For example, in some countries, we have one person who is responsible for all of the conventions, the UN conventions, the 3 of them, plus they're the focal point for all of the climate finance projects in the countries. And so what happens when you get a TOR that needs to be approved for a consultancy that you're doing it may take 3, 4, 5 months, right? And these things add to the implementation deficit. And so this has to be a business case. If the government and governments want to mobilize climate finance at scale, we have to try to have them understand that you can't be penny wise and pound foolish in the short term, because if you have the money, but then you're not spending it, and if you're not spending it, you can't get to effectiveness, because effectiveness is how you use that resource to achieve what is it that you wanted to achieve, which is to build resilience on the ground. So when you look at the rate of our projects being implemented, it is absolutely low. And again, so do you need, if you have 3 or 4 or 5 more bodies and you add up the salary of those persons, even if it's paid for by the project, it's a small percentage relative to the benefits that those projects can have. And so that is always going to be a challenge, but for the duration of the projects, at least you can build that into the costs, but the challenge will be what happens afterwards. And then I also wanted to just say that regional institutions like the one I just mentioned, who are on this panel, CDB, us, and Caribbean Development Bank, countries should see this as a dual strategy. While we are building capacity at the national level, in parallel, countries can be working with regional institutions to help to achieve speed and scale. And so those go together, because if you just focus on national capacity, then generally you start out small, right? And you don't achieve transformation at small scale. At the 5 million, 2 million, 10 million, it's hard to get the transformation that you want. You technically need tens of millions up to hundreds of millions. And so you need a diversified strategy that is being deployed simultaneously or in parallel.
Excellent points, Colin. Excellent points. I wanted to now to Mr. De Villa, Marco. Give you an opportunity to comment on what you've heard from the previous panelists. Say a little bit about your institution, what you're doing, and how you propose, or things that you're doing that would help to address some of the challenges that have been mentioned by the previous speakers.
Indeed, thank you very much. So my name is Marco Davila. I'm the Senior Social Development Specialist at the European Investment Bank, specifically dealing with the topic of fragility and conflict. So that's my thematic area. But I would like to maybe continue on with what the 5C have been discussing. In terms of, so I think we actually have quite a lot of different things to discuss. Let's address a little bit on the implementation capacity, right? The idea of a unified programmatic approach, I think it's an excellent idea, right? There, let's say from the EIB point of view, and we'll get maybe to other development partners as well, this is actually not a problem. It's actually beneficial if we have a unified point of contact, a unified unit or unified capacity. It doesn't have to be a PIU, it can be a development fund or organization, however we want to structure it. This actually makes it only easier for us to operate. Right? Even if the unit or entity is handling multiple different projects, right, from multiple different donors, that can create difficulties. But it's still preferable than maybe having 5, 6, 7 units that are completely disconnected and are actually decreasing the economies of scale for project implementation. Because I do think that project implementation is a very, very important aspect. Project preparation and project implementation are probably where I wouldn't say there's lack of capacity, right? As you said, there are actually smart people everywhere. It's more how to best utilize the capacity that is there. Right. On the development partner side as well, right? If we are organizing 5, 6 different units, right, because of our differing requirements and so on, we are doing something wrong, right? So there's really a need to adapt to the context, right? And from the MDB point of view, there's been an increased awareness, and that we have been adopting differentiated approaches. We have been working on contextualizing what we do. Right? This has, however, been a relatively recent trend. At the EIB, we have our environmental and social standards, our climate bank roadmap, and our strategic approach to fragility and conflict. That sort of all work together to actually give us some flexibility to adopt differentiated approaches. Similar thing, let's say, with the World Bank, that have the fragility and conflict strategy, but these are actually all relatively new approaches. We're somewhat at the stage of where we are still implementing this, or we're starting to implement it, and we're actually trying to figure out ourselves how this works compared to relatively rigid structures that we used to have. Finally, one thing that I would like to also mention that's very important is actually partnerships. So, from the EIB point of view, and in providing assistance in the Caribbean, I think we have several very important partnerships that we're dealing with. In a way, on our side is the partnership with the European Commission for us to obtain more concessional funding and help the Commission implement the Global Gateway Initiative. I think in the region, It's a very important partnership with the Caribbean Development Bank. So with this, initiatives that we have been implementing recently are very, very important. And furthermore, with also other development partners such as UNDP that have bigger presence on the ground and can actually, without going into capacity substitution, can help develop prepare projects and implement projects on the ground. So that would be sort of some of my comments in this area.
Thank you, Marco. So we've heard a lot of issues raised: the issue of simplification, the issue of access, the issue of implementation challenges. But before we turn over to the audience, open up to the audience for questions, I'm going to ask Ms. Isaac from CDB if her thoughts about the preparation of projects, the design of projects, and what CDB is doing to try to aid in that sphere.
Thank you, O'Reilly. Before I mention that, I just wanted to say, as I listened to the other panelists, some really, really important issues raised. The region, the islands are similar but not homogeneous. And I just want to, based on some of the comments EIB made, context really does matter. There were several reasons mentioned why we're unable to, or the client countries are unable to attract climate finance at scale. And this is one, there are several reasons why. However, one of the reasons that the bank determined to be quite important is the inability of the countries to prepare projects that are ready for financing. And one of the things we've tried to do, or we're in the process of establishing, is a climate change project preparation fund. And what is driving that is what we really want to try to do is help our countries increase the number of climate finance ready projects, or I should say finance ready projects. Colin mentioned how poor our stats are in terms of accessing the funding that is available, both whether it's from the Adaptation Fund or the GCF or any one of the other vertical funds. And as we have been working on this fund, we had dialogue with several other partners who either already have similar funds or in the process of establishing funds to get a good sense of some of the lessons learned. And one of the things that we try to, and we will ensure that's done, because we do it with some of our other interventions, is also look at the institutional aspects, the institutional readiness. And I think all of the speakers mentioned that as well. So it's not just the technical readiness, but the institutional readiness, looking at some of the challenges that influence sustainability of projects. So this fund, we figure, would help not just increase the number of finance-ready projects, but also the technical quality. This morning, there was a panel discussion on data, climate data, and leveraging data. And investing in the climate data systems to improve whether it's forecasting, monitoring, resilience, is really also a critical aspect of making some of the projects attractive to investors. So there's a whole ecosystem of aspects that need to be looked at when trying to build out or improve the whole project preparation context for the region. So this is something that the bank is pursuing and will be working with several partners. Thanks, O'Reilly.
Thank you. All right, so we have a lot of things to ponder, and this was a very rich discussion, very salient points to what is a very complex issue. we'll just open it up now to the audience for questions. We're asking that you direct your questions. You say who your question is directed to, if you do have a question, and to be concise in how you you place the question. Thanks.
I'm from Antigua and Barbuda, and my work is at the local level with the local grassroots organizations. Our groups don't have no big funding like you, but they are rich in human resource. As the gentleman from EIB say, we have to be adaptive, use what we have. But what's in the region is that you don't know who you have on the ground. I may need a technical drawing or something for community cistern. We don't have money to pay. I either go on the radio or I go into churches, and you can be sure somebody's gonna put up their hand and said, we'll support you. So resources exist. We keep using, I think it's an excuse that in our islands we have limited resource. That's one of the characteristics of SIDS. No, it's not. The people are there willing to serve, but we don't include them. You mentioned effective stakeholder engagement. Most of the projects that are going forward for funding, have they reached us on the ground that we can put our inputs? No, they have not. And we need access rights to communication, participation. That's the way the situation for the Caribbean will improve. The funding you ask for must reach the local people. I work with these groups, so much requests, but I go to them, I listen to their ideas, and I help them develop their projects, and they get them funding. But at the big higher level, it's not reaching down. And until that happens, we're gonna constantly remain behind. So for me now, I tend to bypass. I'm not hearing from regional agencies, so I go to the other level, the international level, and there you document, you send your case studies, and you be a part of those global decision-making processes. But within the region, it's really poor.
All right, thank you. Very important points. I don't know if any of the panelists feel moved to comment. Colin?
I think the intervention is absolutely on point. You know, you can't build resilience to climate change top down. You have to build it from the bottom up. Regrettably, some of how we work, the 5 Cs, for example, is an organization that is responsive to the governments. We work through governments. And governments then identify the priorities. For example, there is in every country for the Green Climate Fund, to make the point, they develop a country program, a list of investments that they would want to get. And as part of that country program, there ought to be consultations with everybody, including civil society organizations. And as part of the projects that are funded through the Green Climate Fund that we're managing, like in Barbados, we have about close to 100 million. On those project steering committees, and in the design phase, there was also the civil society representation. We have youth representation and to try to be inclusive. But I would encourage the civil society organizations to ensure that in the development of the country programs, that their priorities are included. And you're absolutely right. There are resources there now. It comes to the point of the issues around procurement and the rules. Let me give you a very practical one. While there might be persons within the communities or the population that has the technical expertise or the knowledge systems that exist, if they're to provide service to the project, then there are certain rules they have to follow. They have to do things around AML and CFT. They have to be able to show a track record of implementing similar projects. They have to be able to, if it's a project that they want to, say, install cisterns, while they have the experience and the construction track record, and have you done similar projects at this scale? Do you have access to the financing to have performance guarantees and performance bonds at the banks? And before you know it, the current system crowds out the local persons from participating. So you will have something like we're building 1,500 personal water tanks platforms in Barbados, and then we get a company from Europe or a company from a developed country because they meet all of the procurement requirements from the donor agency or the procurement requirements. And so what we're trying to do is how do we then break these procurement into smaller lots to ensure that you could now tailor to some of the small size of the private sector in the Caribbean. Because when we talk about private sector, there's the private sector and then there's the Caribbean reality of the private sector, which is a very tiny, small business. And that is why sometimes you can't, even though you would want to work as an implementing entity, our procurement rules and the procurement requirements of the donor sometimes don't lend itself to crowd in their participation. But in terms of the involvement, I think we have an obligation to ensure that we are listening, we're inclusive, we're including the vulnerable groups, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build the resilience of people and communities on the ground, and civil society and local community organizations should be a fundamental part of that process.
Excellent response. Marco?
And I think continuing on, right, there are two important aspects here, right? What you touch on is what's now becoming the differentiated approaches, right? The interesting thing is it's been present in the development community, but sort of also kind of hidden. I'll give some examples from this region where we are now, because this is actually, and I'm sorry to use out-of-region examples, but just to illustrate how you can work differently, right? I spent 6 months personally in Tajikistan, helping Tajikistan organize to accept refugees from Afghanistan after the fall of the government to the Taliban. I go to the villages. I talk to all the different levels of government entities. I talk to the beneficiaries. I talk to grandmother on the side of the road, because I do speak Russian from the work that I've done in the region, right? About the inconvenience of the trucks going down the road and how this affects her and so on. There needs to be more of a ground presence. There needs to be a better understanding of the local knowledge. This is probably what I'll say, that the international organizations are still only starting to recognize the value of embedded local knowledge. This was an example, actually, I think it was from Georgia, where all the engineers said, don't worry, you can do the road like this. The avalanche is not going to cover it. The local people said, no, you don't do it like that. The avalanche is going to destroy the road. You will destabilize the ground. Guess what? They built the road, destabilized. They didn't listen to the local people. Yeah. So give us a bit of time, right? I know to some people it's been already apparent for a while, but as organizations we're sort of just starting to become more aware of it, to be more on the ground, utilize the local knowledge, I actually don't like the stakeholder consultation expression, but much more of an engagement, a dialogue. Yeah. And I think that will greatly contribute to the effectiveness, right? And increasing the capacity and utilizing it better for the benefit of the countries.
Okay. Thank you. We have time for one more question. And then after this question and the answers to this question, I'm going to put PS on notice that I'll give him the last word as country, as basically the client in all of this and the beneficiary in all of this. If that's okay, PS? All right. One more question.
Thank you. I actually have two questions. Cheryl Senhouse from the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. Dr. Young, I think your comments about the need to continue to engage in the UNFCCC processes were very salient. And I'd want to hear from you your perspective on some of the other changes you may want to see coming out of the funding agencies aligned with the convention, other than the bureaucracy and the pace that we know are the go-to challenges, but what other specific changes would you want to see for those funding agencies to better be able to serve the needs of the region? And then just a final question to the entire panel for whoever cares to respond. I think you've all spoken to the need to build capacity within the region. How do we encourage and influence our regional leaders to make the investments internally within the structure of our governments to ensure that the resources, the human resources, are put in place to be able to address and access the climate finance that is available. I think, Valerie, you spoke to financial resources in terms of what the CDB is doing. There are other initiatives that, like CFANs, that help governments by embedding persons within the governments, but how do we encourage the governments to make that own investment themselves so that you don't continually have the situation of the chicken versus the egg in terms of accessing the climate finance?
Thank you. I think that was directed to Colin.
I will answer the first one, and then not to hog up the time so my other colleagues can respond to the second. In terms of what are some of the other changes we'd want to see from the funding agencies, I think one of the sort of low-hanging fruit, at least is the issue of harmonization across the funds. We are accredited to the Adaptation Fund and to the GCF, yes. And even though these are both financial mechanisms under the convention, the access requirements are actually quite different. Even the reporting requirements are very different. And so there is absolutely no reason, in my view, why there can't be broad agreements between these funds to simplify the requirements. And so that is one. The other thing is that it's interesting who works at these funds. There needs to be a diversification of thought and experiences and cultures and from geographic regions, because oftentimes you engage with people who are reviewing proposals who have no idea about the lived reality of persons in different parts of the world. And while that might sound as a sort of a philosophical issue, if you don't understand the realities of a small island developing state, it's hard for you to make sense of what we're trying to make in this proposal as to why we're designing a particular project this way. So one of the issues coming up right now is this issue of a per capita metric. So the idea is that funds want to maximize the number of beneficiaries. So for every dollar that they invest, they want to maximize the number of people that are benefiting. When you work in the Caribbean, because the populations are so small, you take St. Kitts and Nevis, right? And then you get a $50 million project, and you divide the number of beneficiaries by 50 million, and all of a sudden, each person is getting thousands of dollars, and they're like, whoa, that's too high. So how do you value the life and the resilience of a person in a small island developing state? So I think, so when you look at the funds generally, and I think they're getting better, is that the people who are in charge of the investment decisions are people who come from the same global financial architecture that has not been working for us. And I think that is one of the areas we have to go. And then the other big one that CARICOM member states has been pushing for to help bridge this barrier is to have more regional presence of these funds in the different geographic areas, so that they're closer to the countries and closer to what's happening on the ground. Because we've noticed when we get the funders to come and visit our countries and they're taken to the sites and they're taken to the various parts to see the vulnerability from climate change. It's like a light bulb go off in their heads, and we need that presence. So I'll stop there with one last comment to say that it is very clear to us that the issue of speed and scale are not mutually exclusive. We work with the USAID. We got a 27 million grant many years ago, and the whole process from concept to actually getting the first disbursement was 8 months. There's absolutely no reason why it needs to take 3 years or 4 years. But that bureaucracy that you didn't want me to focus about is part of the problem. Because they seem to think that the larger the amount of money you get, they have to be more careful that it's not going to be squandered. And that is a fundamental problem. So it can be simplified, and not just on paper, but simplified in terms of ensuring that once you've done the due diligence and you've ensured yourself that there is all the proper procedures in place, that there should be acceleration of the process. And the costs, I don't know about the experience of CDB, but our projects that is over 25 million in size cost about $1 million to develop. $1 million. Luckily, we were able to get that through the project preparation facility of the GCF, but it's expensive.
Yes, good project preparation is very expensive. I see Rodinal wanted to comment.
Yeah, I want to take a stab at Cheryl's second question. It's not an easy one, Cheryl. It's getting the governments to reform. That's one of the most difficult things. The question is who makes the case to them, right? Because if they can't see it internally and not prepared to act, somebody needs to sort of stimulate them to act. And I think that's where the regional institutions can come in. So I want to suggest us to call in. What we can do is, as one of the outcomes of this engagement, when we go back to the heads, we could say to the heads, this is something that has come up, which is urgent, and we need to put it on the agenda of the heads, run it through the relevant ministerial council, identify the regional institution that can take the lead in doing that reform. I would say, for example, the Caribbean Center for Development Administration might do it, working with the regional institutions that have already tried to do reforms at the program level, and to come up with a system that would result in a more optimal allocation of the available resources, to support the climate agenda, to address the implementation deficits that we've been speaking about. I think that's a practical way to do it, because that's how CARICOM works, or that's how CARICOM is supposed to work. And I would even say, I see the OECS in the audience, so the OECS can also assist in that effort. So I think that's a concrete thing that we could pursue. And looking at the head of government that has quasi-cabinet responsibility for environment and climate action. I think that's St. Lucia, right, Paul? So you might want to talk about that. So we can work together. It's fortuitous that there are a number of us on the panel that can work together to address that in a systematic way, using the organs and processes of CARICOM. I think that's the way we should do it. Or that's one way we could attempt to do it.
All right, thank you, Roddy. P.S. Hilaire, I'm going to give you the last word before we close. And I see there are a few more questions in the audience. I'm going to encourage you to approach us after the session if you're targeting a specific panelist, and we will try to address your question at that point in time. But we're genuinely out of time. P.S.
Thank you again. There are a number of points that were raised. The first one is the issue of projects being developed and persons who are affected, or persons who are part of the project or living with the projects are not consulted in the conceptualization stage. We at the Ministry of Economic Development, we have a approach to developing projects. From the onset, we engage persons who are or going to be affected. We sit down with them, we have a dialogue with them with a view to determine how those projects will impact on their livelihoods, the way of life, and what um, mitigating measures that you can put in place to ensure that you minimize the disruption that those persons would have gone through. Even quite recently, we were putting together a project in the southeastern part of Saint Lucia, which is Switzerland, and we did consult with a number of the persons in the area, and surprisingly, we got an objection which went to the World Bank of indigenous Indians in that area. Now, we were taken aback because whilst we know that, the whole history of how the indigenous people move through the region, we never realized that there was such a situation. So right away the project came to a halt, and they indicated that they were not consulted. So we had to now engage them, have meetings with them. We engaged institutions like the Folk Research Center, which really are the custodians of all those historical and cultural data. And they themselves were not even aware of that very small settlement. So just to show you that how impactful those projects are and the kind of engagement that we do in preparing the projects. So I would say that if projects are done and those persons are overlooked, I don't think it's intentional, but perhaps you were not aware of the existence of those persons in those areas. You also spoke about accessing funding for the project. I must say one of the most restrictive rules that we have as far as project implementation is concerned is our procurement rules. And I believe the design of the procurement rules were done to ensure, I don't want to see whether there's an issue of trust or persons, the donors have concerns with squandering of funds or what have you. But we have to be real, and that may very well be the notion upon which those very restrictive rules or preconditions are imposed so you could access the funding. And therefore, in those instances, you can't ask for a derogation at times, but most times it will be for very small amounts. And in so doing, to ensure that the micro and small enterprises are not left out. And you could get those approval to be done at the national level, depending on the quantum of the thing. And as we heard earlier on, when you hear of a private sector and you put the Caribbean in context with what is happening with the rest of the world, we are already very, very small. And if those small and micro persons are not participating in the economic process, you could well imagine how small they are. And therefore, in most of our development national plans that we do, we always ensure that we have budgeted small amounts for what we call grassroots projects. Projects of about, I'm trying to do the conversion, maybe about 25,000 US or less, where you do not go through all those rigorous approval process for that to happen. The final point I would want to touch on is institutional and legislative reform. You still have a lot of agencies in the region where, and as the chairman said, to get simple approvals, you have to go to cabinet to get it done. And that in itself prolonged the whole period of getting projects approved and implementation. I must say, fortunately for us in St. Lucia, we have done a number, and it has a history. It started a very, very long time ago when even myself and Roddy Dad was in the junior economist, well then he was my chief economist. So, and we were from very early, we were given that autonomy at that level to be able to make certain decisions, look at projects, develop projects, approach funding agencies, and so the involvement of cabinet was very much rigid. So we have continued with that at our national level, where at the PS level and at the ministry level, we have significant significant authority in proceeding with implementation of the projects. Thank you, Chair.
Excellent. So with that, we come to the end. There were some excellent points raised. We spoke about the simplification of the means by which we get access to climate financing. There were issues related to capacity building and government reform. There were issues to how we engage with the grassroots, with the people who are impacted by our projects. And the issues related to implementation and project preparation. And I think we only scratched the surface this morning, but it was a very high quality debate that we had, discussion. I think we had a very high quality panel, and I would like us to give them a round of applause. We appreciate you. Yes, and the conversation is just beginning, and they are open. They've promised me that they open after this if you need to approach them for more comments. And we look forward to engaging with you over the course of the rest of the week. Thank you.